What if the biggest obstacle to clean, affordable energy is that it works too well? It's a question that unravels not into conspiracy, but into a quiet, persistent truth. Throughout modern history, some of the most promising energy technologies weren't sidelined because they failed, but because they succeeded in ways that threatened the status quo. This is not a story about secret plots or shadowy cabals. It's a story about systems, economic, political, and industrial, that depend on scarcity, control, and profit. It's a story about what happens when a solution doesn't fit the business model of those who sell the problem. From the wind-swept plains of Idaho to the depths of nuclear laboratories, from the roar of tidal waters to the silence of a car with no engine oil to change, we will explore 10 extraordinary energy breakthroughs. Each of them solved a major challenge. Each of them worked. And each of them, when it proved too effective, too independent, too unprofitable, was quietly shut down, blocked, or buried. Take the integral fast reactor, a nuclear design that couldn't melt down, ate its own waste, and used materials we already had in storage for fuel. Or Boise's geothermal heating system, which piped naturally hot water through homes and buildings for free until regulations and market pressures pushed it into obscurity. Or atmospheric water generators that pulled drinking water from humid air with no plumbing, only to be restricted in regions where water scarcity is most dire. These aren't footnotes in fringe history. They are glimpses into a parallel energy future, one where power is abundant, safe, and decentralized. But in that world, who profits? This series invites you on a journey through 14 chapters, each focusing on a single technology or case study connected by a shared thread, the tension between discovery and denial, between what we can do and what we're allowed to do. Each chapter begins with a moment, a scene, an invention, a decision that could have changed the trajectory of energy in our world. Along the way, we will meet forgotten scientists, erased inventors, abandoned towns, and lost technologies. But more than that, we will wrestle with a deeper question. Why do we so often silence the solutions we most desperately need? This is not about blame. It's about recognition, because buried beneath the politics and economics are stories of human brilliance, of engineers, dreamers, and visionaries who saw beyond what was permitted. This is a story about memory, about what we remember, what we forget, and what we choose not to see. And at its heart, this is a story about possibility. So we begin not with what was lost, but with what was proven. In the mid-1980s, deep in a national laboratory in Illinois, a group of engineers quietly lit the fuse on what could have been the future of nuclear energy. It was safe, it was clean, and it was shut down. The reason? It worked too well. Welcome to a journey through the inventions that dared to offer power without permission, and the systems that said no. This is the first chapter in the story of energy that almost was. It started with a deliberate failure, the kind engineers aren't supposed to allow. In 1986, a team at Argonne National Laboratory turned off the cooling system of their nuclear reactor. They didn't simulate a meltdown. They caused the exact conditions that should have led to one, but the meltdown never came. The integral fast reactor, or IFR, shut itself down, silently, automatically, without any mechanical intervention. It didn't need human hands or computer overrides. It relied on physics, and physics, it turns out, was enough. This was not science fiction. It was one of the most advanced nuclear energy designs ever built. It didn't just resist meltdown, it consumed nuclear waste as fuel. It bred its own energy from uranium stockpiles sitting idle in storage. It eliminated the need for complex fuel fabrication and disposal. It solved, in one design, the three core criticisms of nuclear power: safety, waste, and cost. For 10 years, scientists refined it. They tested it, proved it, and prepared it for commercial demonstration. Then, in 1994, Congress pulled the plug, not because it had failed, but because it hadn't. The official explanation was budget cuts, but the quiet undercurrent told a different story. The IFR didn't fit the economics of the energy industry. It bypassed the need for uranium enrichment, a multi-billion-dollar business. It minimized waste, undercutting the expensive long-term storage industry. It offered abundant, stable electricity that would threaten fossil fuel markets and disrupt utility pricing models. If energy became too safe, too clean, and too cheap, where would the profit go? The reactor was dismantled. The research team disbanded. The plans shelved. And yet, in those lab rooms and test reactors, the future had already happened. A nuclear reactor that could not melt down, that could power entire regions using fuel we already had, that could run for centuries without mining another ounce of uranium. What died was not just a project. It was a vision of what nuclear power could have been, not a source of fear, but of abundance, not a hazard, but a solution. The IFR now exists mostly in footnotes, known by a few scientists, forgotten by the public. But it worked. And in the places where it worked too well, it was not allowed to continue. In the wake of disasters like Chernobyl and Fukushima, it's easy to be cynical about nuclear energy. But what if the safer alternative was already built and buried? It leaves us with a haunting question. How many other technologies, proven and perfected, sit in silence today because they threatened to succeed too completely? As we leave the sealed corridors of Argonne and step into the wider landscape of energy history, one thing becomes clear. The most dangerous thing a clean energy system can be is viable. Next, we turn west to a city warmed not by wires or fuel, but by the earth itself. A quiet miracle hidden beneath the streets of Boise, Idaho. Free heat, flowing, untapped, and unwanted by those who couldn't sell it. It rises with the steam, not from machines, but from the earth. Beneath the streets of Boise, Idaho, flows an ancient river of heat. For over a century, it has offered something nearly miraculous: warmth without combustion, comfort without cost. In 1890, Boise became one of the first cities in the world to adopt geothermal district heating. And for decades, it worked so well that it disrupted everything. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Wells tapped into a naturally heated aquifer. Water at 170 degrees Fahrenheit rose without pumping. It flowed through insulated pipes into buildings, homes, offices, even the state capitol, and then returned underground, reheated by geology, not gas. There were no fuel deliveries, no combustion, no smoke, no emissions. Just silent, consistent warmth from the planet's core. By the 1920s, hundreds of buildings relied on it. And that, for the utilities, became the problem. Electric companies wanted to sell space heaters. Natural gas suppliers wanted to install furnaces. But geothermal water couldn't be metered like gas or electricity. Once the pipes were in, the heat was essentially free. Infrastructure was a one-time investment. The earth did the rest. So pressure mounted, not through direct confrontation, but through slow erosion. Regulations changed. Building codes began to require backup systems using gas or electric heat, even in buildings with geothermal access. Banks hesitated to finance geothermal-only projects. Insurance premiums crept higher. Permits were delayed. Expansion plans were quietly denied. By the 1970s, despite a booming population, Boise's geothermal system served fewer buildings than it had 50 years earlier. The technology hadn't failed. It had been fenced in. But the earth kept heating the water. In the 1980s, during an energy crisis, interest flickered back. The system was modernized and expanded. Today, it heats around 100 buildings. The state capitol still runs on geothermal. And the aquifer beneath Boise? It could easily heat the entire city. It doesn't. not because it can't, but because free heat doesn't feed utility profits. A city warmed by geology alone doesn't need fuel deliveries. It doesn't need fluctuating gas prices. It doesn't generate monthly bills. And that, more than any technical barrier, has kept Boise from becoming a model for the world. Boise is proof that the Earth provides, silently, generously. And it's proof of how systems built on profit resist abundance. It's easy to imagine a future where every city on a geothermal fault uses this model, where infrastructure investment pays itself off in years, where heating is clean, free, and endless. But it's harder to imagine the companies that profit from heating letting that happen. Beneath the quiet streets of Boise flows a question. What if we stopped asking how to make heating cheaper and started asking why we ignore the free version? Next, we rise into the air to find water, not in rivers or reservoirs, but in the very humidity we breathe. And we'll ask why pulling water from thin air became too good an idea to be allowed to thrive. It begins with a breath. Every moment the air around us holds invisible rivers of water. Humidity, soft, suspended, unnoticed, surrounds us, waiting. In the 1930s, a few inventors asked a simple question. What if we could drink it? Atmospheric water generators do just that. They cool air below the dew point, causing moisture to condense. The result is pure, distilled water, drawn directly from the sky. No wells, no pipes, no aqueducts. Just electricity, condensation, and collection. By the 1970s, refinements made the technology more efficient. In humid climates, small units could produce hundreds of gallons per day. In places where water was scarce but humidity was high, the American South, parts of India, coastal Africa, these machines were nothing short of revolutionary. One machine, one plug, one source of clean water. And yet, these devices remain rare, not because they failed, but because they didn't. Water utilities saw the writing in the mist. If homes, farms, and businesses could extract their own water, who would need monthly bills? Municipal water systems rely on fees. Fees that fund infrastructure, yes, but also profit margins and bureaucracies. A machine that bypassed all of it was, in a sense, too independent. So barriers rose. Some jurisdictions began classifying atmospheric water generators as wells, triggering permits and restrictions. Others declared the collected water non-potable, despite it being chemically identical to distilled water. Building codes required connections to city water, even when a property generated its own supply. In some states, occupancy permits were denied unless applicants paid for municipal water, whether they used it or not. Incredibly, in certain western states, condensing water from air was equated with rainwater collection and was legally restricted under water rights laws. The logic: water vapor in the air was part of the watershed. Condensing it, therefore, stole from downstream users. The absurdity didn't matter. The message did. The technology worked. It just worked too well. Today, you can still buy a small atmospheric water generator, but scaling up remains tangled in regulation, resistance, and neglect. In the places where the machines make the most sense, humid, water-scarce regions, they are often the hardest to implement legally. And so, we remain tethered to water systems that are aging, expensive, and often fragile, while the sky above offers a quiet alternative. There's a strange irony here. The very atmosphere we treat as an afterthought carries life-giving potential. But because we can't meter the clouds, we decline the rain. In a world where droughts grow more common and water wars loom, what does it mean to suppress a technology that pulls water from air? Next, we drive forward, or at least we once did, to a car so quiet it was nearly invisible, and so efficient it became unacceptable. A car that proved electric vehicles worked, and was then crushed one by one before the world could catch up. It moved in silence, smooth, swift, and clean. In the late 1990s, on sunlit roads in California and Arizona, a new kind of car began to appear. It didn't hum, it didn't roar, it glided. The EV1, General Motors' first mass-produced electric vehicle, wasn't a concept or a prototype. It was real, and for a brief, flickering moment, it was the future. The EV1 wasn't just an experiment, it was a breakthrough. With a sleek aerodynamic frame, rapid acceleration, and a range of over 80 miles, it fit the daily lives of most drivers. Owners charged them at home, overnight. No oil changes, no gas stations, no tailpipes. Maintenance costs dropped. Satisfaction soared. Drivers loved them, and that love became the problem. The EV1 threatened more than the internal combustion engine. It threatened an entire economic ecosystem built around vehicle maintenance and fuel. Oil companies saw the numbers. Each EV1 on the road eliminated about 500 gallons of gasoline per year. Multiply that by millions, and it wasn't a car. It was an existential threat. Dealerships saw the writing on the wall. No engines meant no oil changes, no transmission failures, no muffler replacements. Service departments, which often account for more profit than car sales, would suffer. The EV1 was too simple, too reliable, too independent. Then came the quiet recall. Despite waiting lists and public demand, GM repossessed every single EV1. Drivers begged to purchase their leased vehicles. Protests erupted, but GM refused. Every car was rounded up, sent to scrapyards, and crushed. Only a handful remain, disabled, museum pieces in name only. The official explanation: there was no market for electric vehicles. But the market was never given a chance. The EV1 didn't fail, it was buried. Then, in a second blow, GM sold the patent for the advanced nickel metal hydride battery used in the EV1. The buyer? Chevron, one of the largest oil companies in the world. For years afterward, that battery technology was locked away, unavailable for automotive use. A technological chokehold disguised as intellectual property. It took more than a decade, and the rise of Tesla, before electric vehicles regained momentum. By then, precious time had been lost, infrastructure delayed, public perception warped. All because a car worked too well for the system it drove into. The EV1 wasn't a dream. It was real. It was on the road. And it was erased not because it couldn't work, but because it did. What lingers is a question that still echoes down our highways. If we had embraced electric vehicles in 1996, where would we be now? Next, we dive back into the atomic heart of energy innovation, but this time not with uranium, but with a quieter element, one that burns clean, safe, and can't make bombs. A nuclear future built not for war, but for peace, and abandoned when it refused to serve the machinery of conflict. It glowed not with danger, but with possibility. In the 1960s, deep within Oak Ridge National Laboratory, a quiet revolution was taking place. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't promise power beyond comprehension. Instead, it offered something simpler, and in many ways more radical: safety. The molten salt reactor experiment was fueled not by uranium, but by thorium, a silvery, slightly radioactive metal 3 to 4 times more abundant than uranium. Thorium reactors can't melt down. They don't operate under high pressure. Their waste is minimal, and more importantly, it becomes safe in hundreds of years instead of tens of thousands. The design was genius. If the system overheated, a freeze plug at the bottom of the reactor would melt, and the liquid fuel would drain safely into storage tanks. No explosion, no meltdown, just a quiet shutdown written into the laws of physics. The reactor ran from 1965 to 1969, operating smoothly. The scientists involved didn't just test theory, they proved it. It was one of the safest nuclear systems ever built. And then it was shut down. Why? Not because it failed, but because it couldn't be used to make bombs. You see, thorium reactors don't produce plutonium, the material needed for nuclear weapons. And at the height of the Cold War, the nuclear industry wasn't just about power, it was about military strategy. Civilian energy programs were deeply tied to weapons development. Light water reactors, which now dominate the world, were selected not just for energy, but because they produce weapons-grade material as a byproduct. Thorium couldn't offer that. It was clean, peaceful, unweaponized. And so it was quietly discarded. The molten salt reactor experiment was shut down. The research team disbanded. The blueprints filed away. A superior nuclear technology was mothballed, not because it couldn't help the world, but because it couldn't help the arms race. Today, countries like China and India are reviving thorium research. They see what was once dismissed, a reactor that's safer, cheaper, and more sustainable. But in the United States, thorium remains a footnote. The infrastructure, investment, and political will remain locked in the uranium age. We often hear that nuclear power is dangerous or too expensive or politically fraught. But what if that's only because we chose the wrong kind? What if we had built reactors that served life instead of war? In the flicker of a molten salt reactor lies a haunting reminder: the best technologies don't always win. Sometimes they lose because they don't serve the dominant powers of their time. Next, we walk into a field, not of wires or reactors, but of plants. A green fuel grown in the sun that once powered a car built by Henry Ford. A crop banned not for its danger, but for its potential to disrupt the empires of oil, plastic, and paper. A solution harvested and then outlawed. It rustled in the wind, tall, green, and misunderstood. Hemp, a plant as old as agriculture itself, grown for fiber, for oil, for paper, and perhaps most radically for fuel. In 1941, Henry Ford unveiled a car built partially from hemp fibers and designed to run on hemp ethanol. He believed in a future where fuel didn't come from deep wells in the earth, but from the soil beneath our feet. Hemp, he argued, could power the modern world. And he was right. Hemp produces more ethanol per acre than corn, up to twice as much. It grows fast, thrives in poor soil, needs little water or fertilizer, and doesn't compete with food crops. Its biodiesel is chemically identical to petroleum diesel and works in existing engines with no modification. Its emissions are cleaner, and its carbon footprint is nearly neutral. From a fuel standpoint, it was perfect, but perfection, once again, became the problem. In 1937, the U.S. passed the Marijuana Tax Act, effectively banning hemp cultivation. Though industrial hemp contains negligible THC and cannot be used as a drug, it was swept up in a wave of moral panic. Or more precisely, industrial lobbying. Oil companies feared competition from hemp fuel. Chemical giants like DuPont had invested in synthetic fibers and plastics. Hemp was a threat to their new empire. Paper magnates saw in hemp a crop that could outpace trees in yield and speed. And so, a plant that could offer clean fuel, strong fiber, and sustainable paper was criminalized under the guise of drug control. The ban lasted over 80 years. During that time, entire industries entrenched themselves around petroleum for fuel, for plastic, for fibers, for profits. Infrastructure was built. Investments were locked in. And the idea that farmers could grow their own energy quietly faded from memory. Only in 2018 was industrial hemp re-legalized in the United States. But by then, the damage had been done. Processing facilities were gone, knowledge was lost, and fuel production from hemp remains, even today, virtually non-existent. It's not because it doesn't work, it's because it worked too well. Hemp could be the cornerstone of a decentralized, farmer-led fuel revolution. But revolutions that don't generate centralized profits tend to be delayed or derailed. We are told that the future of green energy lies in high-tech innovations, lab breakthroughs, and cutting-edge devices. But sometimes the solution has been growing in the dirt all along. What does it say about our priorities when a clean, renewable fuel crop is banned for nearly a century? Not for what it does wrong, but for what it might do right. Next, we turn to the sea, to a force as ancient as the moon itself. Tides, rising and falling with predictable rhythm, hold the power to light up nations. And yet that power, too, has been contained, not by nature, but by design. It moves with the moon. Twice a day, the oceans breathe, tides rising and falling with a rhythm older than humanity. This ancient motion, steady and predictable, carries with it an overlooked gift: energy. Tidal power is unlike any other renewable. It doesn't depend on sun or wind. It doesn't fluctuate with weather or seasons. It is governed by celestial mechanics, calculable centuries in advance. Of all the renewables, it is the only one that is truly predictable. And yet it remains strangely absent from the global energy conversation. The technology exists. It has for decades. In France, the Laurence tidal power station has operated since 1966, generating reliable electricity for over 55 years. In South Korea and Canada, tidal stations have quietly produced power for decades. These systems use underwater turbines or enclosed basins that release water through turbines as tides change. There are no fuels, no emissions, just motion converted into current. The potential is staggering. The United Kingdom alone could generate half its electricity demand from tides. The Bay of Fundy in Canada could power entire provinces. Worldwide, the estimates stretch into hundreds of gigawatts. So why isn't tidal power everywhere? Because once the infrastructure is built, it doesn't need anything else. No fuel deliveries, no pipelines, no price surges, no recurring bills. Tidal power plants can run for 50 years or more with minimal maintenance. That longevity and independence, paradoxically, make them commercially unappealing to traditional utilities. Utilities profit by selling energy, by controlling supply, distribution, and pricing. A tidal plant that delivers steady, predictable power without fuel doesn't fit that model. It undermines it. And so, tidal projects face an endless tide of obstacles. Permitting takes years. Environmental reviews, while necessary, are often weaponized to delay or block. Concerns about marine life, despite decades of data from existing plants, become reasons to stall. Fishing interests are cited, even when fisheries thrive near tidal stations. But the quiet, persistent resistance comes from the energy companies themselves. Because tidal power, once built, grants a kind of freedom, local, clean, and constant. And that's a problem for those who depend on volatility and dependency for revenue. Plans for massive tidal barrages, like the proposed Severn Estuary project in the UK, have been shelved not for lack of feasibility, but for lack of financial alignment with energy markets. The question isn't whether it would work, it's whether it would pay the right people. In the rhythmic churn of the sea lies a truth we've tried to ignore. Not all scarcity is natural. Sometimes it's engineered. Next, we leave the tides and look to the sky, or more precisely, into the ground beneath a tower that once reached for the clouds. A tower built to send power through the air. A dream of global electricity, shared wirelessly. And a warning of what happens when you make energy truly free. It stood like a beacon from another world, a skeletal tower rising from Long Island soil, crowned with a great metal dome. Wardenclyffe Tower was Nikola Tesla's most ambitious project. In 1901, he set out to do something no one had done before, transmit electricity wirelessly, not just across rooms or miles, but across the world. Power without wires. Energy drawn from the earth, broadcast through the air, and received anywhere with the right device. Tesla believed energy should be like air, available to all, accessible everywhere. The science behind his vision was radical, but not baseless. He had already demonstrated wireless power on smaller scales. At Colorado Springs, he lit bulbs without wires, created electrical arcs that danced through the atmosphere. Wardenclyffe was to be the full expression of that dream, a system to transmit information and electricity simultaneously, globally. His financier, J.P. Morgan, funded the project. At first. But when Tesla revealed the true scope of his plan, Morgan hesitated. Wireless communication is all well and good, he is rumored to have said. But where do we put the meter? That single question captured the heart of the matter. Tesla's system, if successful, would bypass the entire infrastructure of the power industry. No poles, no wires, no billing systems, no way to control who used the energy or to charge them for it. It would democratize power in the most literal sense, and so funding was withdrawn. The tower was never completed. In 1917, it was demolished, sold for scrap, its dream disassembled bolt by bolt. Tesla died in 1943, penniless and largely forgotten. His patents, his notebooks, his eccentric ideas dismissed until decades later when his predictions began to come true. Wireless communication, remote control, radio, even wireless charging. But the one vision that never returned, the one that frightened industrialists most, was free electricity. Not because it couldn't work, but because it couldn't be monetized. To this day, we don't know if Tesla's global power system would have functioned at scale. The physics is debated. But what's clear is this: the experiment wasn't shut down because it failed. It was shut down before it could be allowed to try. The Wardenclyffe Tower is now a ghost of potential, a symbol of a road not taken, a reminder that innovation can be silenced, not by failure, but by threat to profit. And it leaves us with an unsettling question. What if the greatest leap in energy history was stopped? Not because it was impossible, but because it was unprofitable? Next, we descend from global dreams to community solutions. Small plots of land, bright with solar panels, shared by neighbors, renters, and families without rooftops of their own. A solar garden blooming with independence, and soon fenced in by regulations that favored the old ways of power. It looked like a field of light, scattered across sunny plots in Minnesota, Colorado, and Massachusetts. Rows of solar panels began to appear in the mid-2010s, not atop rooftops, but planted in open land. These were community solar gardens, and they were changing everything. The idea was simple. Not everyone can install solar on their home. Maybe their roof is shaded. Maybe they rent. Maybe the upfront cost is too high. But what if they could own a piece of a shared solar array, a garden of panels generating power for all? Each household bought a share. In return, they received credit on their electricity bill for the energy their panels produced. No installation, no maintenance, just clean power, shared among neighbors, and it worked beautifully. Because these installations were built on optimal land, flat, sunny, affordable, they produced more power per dollar than rooftop panels. Because they were large and centralized, they benefited from economies of scale. And because they bypassed the need for individual property ownership, they opened solar access to renters, low-income families, and urban dwellers. Electricity bills dropped. Predictability returned. Some households saw 20–30% savings, locked in for decades. Then came the resistance. Utilities saw what was happening. Community solar users were reducing their dependence on the grid, and with it, utility revenues. The model wasn't just green, it was independent. That made it dangerous. So began the quiet campaign to contain it. States imposed arbitrary caps, allowing only a tiny percentage of the population to participate, even as demand soared. Utilities lobbied to add new fees, grid access charges, standby fees, interconnection costs. These were designed not to cover costs, but to erode the financial appeal of going solar. Net metering policies, which once credited solar users at retail rates, were slashed. Now, excess solar power was bought at wholesale, cutting the value of participation in half. Permits were delayed. Environmental reviews became mandatory for solar farms, but not for fossil plants. The barriers grew taller year by year. By 2018, states that had led the way in community solar were slowing down. Projects sat in limbo. Households were turned away, not because the technology failed, but because it worked too well. Community solar is the embodiment of local power. It breaks the monopoly. It spreads access. It reduces emissions. And that, in a system built on centralized control, is a threat. The sun doesn't send a bill, but someone else will. We are often told to go green, to use renewable energy. But when communities do just that, together, cooperatively, affordably, they often find themselves facing invisible walls. In the glow of shared solar gardens lies a quiet rebellion, a way to reclaim power without waiting for permission. Next, we follow the streams, not of sunlight, but of water, trickling through hills and valleys, once harnessed by small dams to power towns, farms, and mills. An energy source as old as civilization, and slowly regulated into extinction. It began with a stream, a simple current tumbling over rocks. For centuries, humans have used flowing water to turn wheels, grind grain, and light lamps. But in the early 20th century America, a quiet revolution bloomed along creeks and rivers, small-scale hydroelectric power. From 1900 to 1940, thousands of miniature hydroelectric dams dotted the countryside. They weren't massive. They didn't demand rivers to be reshaped. They were built by farmers, towns, and small businesses, producing just enough electricity for a home, a mill, a main street. They were independent, resilient, and astonishingly effective. These systems required no fuel. The water flowed, the turbines turned, and power came, reliably, quietly, and often for free after the initial setup. Over time, the installations paid for themselves, leaving decades of virtually costless electricity in their wake. By 1940, over 3,000 small hydro plants operated across the United States. Rural America had power and autonomy, and then it began to disappear. As centralized utilities expanded, these small systems became a nuisance. If people could generate their own electricity, they wouldn't need to buy it. And if they didn't buy it, there was no profit to be made. So the pressure began, not through bans but through burden. New regulations demanded expensive upgrades, safety reviews, environmental assessments, fish passage requirements. Even for creeks that had run dams for 80 years without incident, new costs loomed. Engineering reports, insurance, structural retrofits. Some operators were told to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to continue generating just a few $1,000s worth of electricity per year. Permitting became labyrinthine. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission assumed authority even over tiny operations. Insurance companies hiked premiums for dam owners. Environmental concerns, often valid in large systems, were now used to stifle even the smallest ones. And as compliance costs rose, one by one, these independent energy systems were abandoned. Not because they failed, but because they were made unaffordable. By 1980, most small hydro plants were gone. Thousands of proven, working installations shut down under the weight of regulatory pressure. Some have been restored in recent decades, framed as renewable energy. But the same permitting nightmares persist. A farmer wanting to revive a microhydro plant might spend more on approvals than the system would ever earn. Meanwhile, fossil fuel plants face fewer barriers. The irony is sharp. These were the original green energies. They worked, they were sustainable, they empowered communities, and they were systematically erased. Today, small hydro is often romanticized, charming remnants of a simpler time. But what they truly represent is lost autonomy. A world where local power meant just that. Power, local and yours. The river still runs, the turbine still turns, but the gate is locked. Next, we reach the final chapter of our journey through silenced solutions. A place where all these paths converge, where technology, innovation, and human need meet a barrier more powerful than failure, the economics of control. It's the same story, told in 10 different ways. A reactor that couldn't melt down, a city heated by the earth, a machine that pulls water from air, a car with no exhaust pipe, a fuel grown in fields, a power plant that rises with the tide, a tower that promised electricity through the air, a garden of shared sunlight, a stream spinning a wheel. All of them proven, practical, and suppressed. Not because they were fantasies or failures, but because they worked too well. In each case, the same pattern unfolds. A breakthrough emerges, offering power that is clean, abundant, and independent. It reduces costs. It minimizes complexity. It empowers people. And that's precisely the problem. The systems we live within, economic, political, infrastructural, are not designed for abundance. They are designed for control, for revenue, for dependence. An energy source that doesn't require fuel shipments or billing departments, that doesn't break down or wear out, that can't be metered or monopolized. Such a source may be a triumph of engineering, but it is a disaster for business models built on scarcity. So the tools of suppression appear, quietly, persistently. Funding is withdrawn, patents are buried, permits are denied, regulations are reshaped, myths are spread. Technologies vanish not in flames, but in filing cabinets. Not with scandal, but with silence. What unites all these stories isn't just the innovation, it's the resistance to it. And in that resistance, we see a deeper truth. The energy crisis is not purely technical. It is structural. We have the tools. We have the knowledge. What we lack is permission. Not from nature, but from ourselves. When Tesla's tower was torn down, it wasn't because the Earth rejected it. When the EV1 was crushed, it wasn't because it couldn't drive. When the molten salt reactor was mothballed, it wasn't because the atoms stopped splitting. The obstacle wasn't science. It was economics. Cheap energy changes everything. It reduces geopolitical tension. It shifts wealth. It transforms who holds power, literally and figuratively. And so, in system after system, solution after solution, the hand comes down. Not loudly, but effectively. We're told to wait, to be patient. That better energy is always just over the horizon, if we can afford it, if we qualify, if the market agrees. But the horizon never arrives. What if it's already behind us? In the end, these stories are not just about energy. They're about possibility and the fear of it. They ask us to reconsider the structures we've inherited and the futures we've been told are impossible. As we turn toward the final chapter, we gather the threads of these forgotten paths. And we ask, what kind of world could we build if we stopped silencing our best solutions? What would it take to choose abundance and to protect it? We stand at the confluence of past inventions, a panorama of what might have been. From Boise's geothermal veins to the silent churn of small hydro dams. From the glinting panels of community solar gardens to the tidal turbines riding the moon's pull. From the EV1 gliding along California roads to thorium and fast reactors humming quietly in laboratories. From hemp fields swaying in the wind to atmospheric water generators pulling life from the air. And from Tesla's towering dream to the molten salt reactors of Oak Ridge, all of them tell the same story. They were never failures. They were too effective, too clean, too independent, too cheap. The consistent pattern is striking. Each time a technology reduces cost, eliminates dependency, or empowers users, it encounters resistance. Not from nature, but from the structures built around scarcity: utilities, regulators, financiers, and entrenched industries that profit from control. Profit in these systems often outweighs progress. And yet, these solutions remain proof of possibility. The technologies exist. They have been tested, built, and in many cases, operated for decades. They provide a blueprint for a world where energy is abundant, accessible, and sustainable. They offer lessons in resilience, ingenuity, and human foresight, but their stories are also cautionary. Innovation alone is not enough. Progress requires alignment between what can be done and what is allowed to flourish. Even the most elegant solution can be buried, delayed, or suppressed if it conflicts with the prevailing economic order. As we reflect, a pattern emerges. Abundance is possible. Independence is possible. Cheap, reliable energy is possible. And yet our global systems persist in favoring scarcity and control. This recognition forces a question, not of technology, but of choice. Do we allow solutions to exist fully, or do we confine them to history and theory? Do we let abundance reshape society, or do we preserve the structures that benefit from limitation? Every generator left idle, every reactor dismantled, every solar garden capped, every stream tamed, they are symbols of what we could have and what we choose not to embrace. And in that tension lies a challenge to reconsider our assumptions, our policies, our incentives, and ultimately our vision of the future. The question remains, if energy could be cheap, clean, and abundant, what would we do with it? Who would it serve? And what kind of world might we build if we finally let it flow? We reach the edge of this journey, carrying the stories of 10 technologies that proved what was possible, and the systems that refused to let them flourish. From the reactors that couldn't melt down, to geothermal pipes warming a city for over a century, to cars and fuels and water drawn from unexpected places, each demonstrates the same truth: abundance is real, practical, and within our grasp. The challenge has never been physics, chemistry, or engineering. It has always been economics, policy, and human priorities. We are left with a profound reflection. Scarcity is not inevitable. Energy need not be expensive, fragile, or monopolized. History shows that the tools to light homes, warm streets, quench thirst, and power vehicles have existed for decades. They were built, tested, and proven. And yet, they were constrained, regulated, or destroyed because they threaten the structures that profit from limitation. These stories also reveal the resilience and creativity of human innovation. They remind us that solutions are born not just from necessity, but from curiosity, persistence, and courage. They show that even when silenced, ideas endure, waiting for recognition, revival, and adoption. The lesson is not despair, but possibility. For every suppressed technology, there exists a path forward. New materials, new policies, new communities willing to embrace abundance. The question is whether society is willing to align its incentives with what we know is possible rather than what maintains the status quo. In the quiet, we can imagine a different future. Cities powered by geothermal warmth, communities supplied by sun and stream, vehicles running silently on renewable fuels, water flowing from the air, tides spinning turbines, and reactors humming safely beneath our feet. A world where energy is not a commodity to be controlled, but a resource to be shared. And perhaps the deepest question lingers still: if we already have the knowledge, the technology, and the capacity to create a world of cheap, abundant energy, why do we continue to choose scarcity? And what will it take, in policy, in culture, in courage, to finally let the solutions live? The energy crisis, it seems, is not a problem of the planet. It is a problem of choice. And the choices we make today will determine whether abundance remains a footnote in history or becomes the defining story of the future.